While she was out, phenomena erupted: bells, voices, physical disturbances. Her companions panicked and broke the circle. Dion, still in trance, began performing involuntary acrobatics, arching on her head and heels, convulsing across the room. One member of the group was thrown across the room by an unseen force and was bedridden for 3 weeks afterwards. It was incidents like these that taught her the absolute necessity of proper training, proper protection, and proper respect for the forces being invoked. Welcome to the Reality Revolution. I'm your host, Brian Scott. Today's episode, we're going to talk about the woman who weaponized magic. I'm going to do a deep dive on Dion Fortune, psychic warfare, and the hidden architecture of reality. Before we get started, I wanted to invite you to join the school community. You can find the link in the description. We hold weekly group sessions. We have amazing training modules available, exclusive content like audiobooks and meditations that you can only get in my school group. You can find it at www.skool.com/reality revolution. In January of 1940, as Nazi bombers darkened the skies over Britain, the nation braced for what many believed would be total annihilation. A woman sat in a small London flat at 3 Queensborough Terrace near the Bayswater Road. She had a pen in hand, she had a purpose in her heart, and she had something else, something most military strategists would have found absolutely incomprehensible. She was writing letters. Every Wednesday without fail, she sent letters to a network of trained occultists scattered across the British Isles. Each letter contained precise instructions for a coordinated meditation and visualization exercise to be performed the following Sunday. The instructions were detailed, the visualizations were vivid, and the intention was staggering in its ambition. This woman believed with every fiber of her being that she could use the focused power of human consciousness to create a psychic shield around the land of Britain. She believed that trained minds working in unison and directed toward a common purpose could project force across dimensions and influence the outcome of history itself. Her name was Dion Fortune, and she would become one of the most influential occultists of the 20th century, a woman whose ideas about consciousness, magic, psychic attack, and the hidden architecture of the cosmos would ripple forward through the decade and influence everything from modern Wicca to the New Age movement to our contemporary understanding of the human mind. But who was she really? How did a quiet, well-bred English girl from an upper middle-class family come to believe she had unlocked the operating system of reality itself? And why nearly 80 years after her death do thousands of serious practitioners still consider her essential reading? This is one of those stories that sounds impossible, and the deeper you go, the stranger it gets. She was born Violet Mary Firth on December 6, 1890, in Llandudno on the north coast of Wales, a seaside resort town perched between two ancient limestone headlands called the Great Orme and the Little Orme, names that trace back to Norse mythology, the dragons of the deep. Remember that detail, it becomes important. Now, her family was wealthy. Her father, Arthur, was connected to the Firths of Sheffield steel fame, one of the great industrial dynasties of Victorian England. Her mother, Sarah Jane, was a woman of strong spiritual leanings. Both parents were practitioners of Christian Science, and both claimed to possess psychic abilities. Sarah, in particular, reported episodes of mediumship and clairvoyance throughout her life. So from her earliest days, Violet grew up in a household where the invisible world was treated as entirely real, where the boundaries between seen and the unseen were considerable and permeable, where the idea that consciousness could extend beyond the physical body was simply a matter of fact. By her early teens, the family had relocated to the West Country of England, and Violet had already published a book called Violets, A reviewer in the Girls' Realm magazine wondered whether time had in store for the world another Elizabeth Barrett Browning or another Emily Bronte. The reviewer could never have imagined what this particular poet would actually become, because Violet was already having experiences that went far beyond poetry. She was seeing things, sensing presences, having vivid dreams of other lives in other places, ancient temples, Egyptian rituals, vast drowned cities beneath green waves. She could feel the moods and intentions of people around her as clearly as you or I might feel the wind on our skin. She knew things she had no earthly way of knowing. She was, by her own later account, a natural psychic of considerable power, and she had absolutely no idea how to handle it. After finishing her education, Violet took a position at a horticultural college in Studleigh, Warwickshire. She was in her early 20s. She was bright, ambitious, and eager to prove herself in the world. And it was here that something happened that would alter the trajectory of her entire life. A woman at the college, a woman who had spent time studying esoteric practices in India, decided, for reasons that remain unclear to this day, to target Violet with what Dion Fortune would later describe as a deliberate, sustained psychic attack. Here's how she described it years later. The woman called her into a room, and for hours, literal hours, this woman hammered at Violet's mind with focused intention, using techniques of mental domination and will projection that she had learned in the East. She told Violet she was incompetent, she had no worth, she had no will of her own, that she was nothing, over and over again, with a force and intensity that it went far beyond more verbal abuse. Violet walked out of that room a shattered woman. She was unable to function. She could barely stand. Her legs gave way. She was bedridden for weeks. Her memory was fractured. Her nervous system was wrecked. And according to her own account, the damage persisted for years. Now, a modern psychologist might look at this and say she was bullied. She experienced a severe emotional breakdown triggered by workplace harassment. And that reading would carry weight, but Dion Fortune insisted for the rest of her life that something more had occurred. She maintained that the woman had used specific trained techniques to project psychic force to directly assault her consciousness with directed intention, and that the effects were as real and as damaging as any physical blow. And here's what makes this so fascinating. Instead of retreating from the experience, instead of closing down and walking away, Violet Firth did something extraordinary. She became determined to understand exactly what had happened to her. She wanted to map the mechanism. She wanted to know how consciousness could be weaponized, and more importantly, how a person could defend against such an assault. This quest, this burning need to understand the technology of the mind, led her first to psychology. She studied Freud, she studied Jung. She worked as a therapist at a psychotherapy clinic in London, treating patients with disorders that conventional medicine could only partially explain. And along the way, she began to suspect that the map of the human psyche drawn by modern psychology was only a fragment of a much larger picture. She had glimpsed in that terrible room in Studleigh something that psychology alone could never explain, and she was going to find out what it was. Around 1919, Violet Firth was initiated into the Alpha et Omega Large of the Stella Matutina, one of the surviving offshoots of a legendary secret society called the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. The Golden Dawn, if you have spent any time studying the history of Western esotericism, you know the name. Funded in 1888, the Golden Dawn was the most influential magical organization the modern West has ever produced. And we'll be doing a deep dive soon on this. Its members included W.B. Yeats, the Nobel Prize-winning poet, Aleister Crowley, the notorious magician of the 20th century, Arthur Machen, the horror writer whose stories would later influence H.P. Lovecraft, Florence Farr, the actress and feminist, and dozens of other artists, intellectuals, and visionaries who believed that behind the veil of ordinary reality lay a vast architecture of spiritual forces that could be directly accessed, mapped, and worked with by trained consciousness. The Golden Dawn systematized centuries of Hermetic philosophy, Kabbalistic cosmology, alchemy, astrology, and ceremonial magic into a structured initiatory path. Members progressed through grades, each corresponding to a sphere on the Kabbalistic tree of life. At each level, new teachings were revealed, new practices were given, and new powers were said to unfold. Violet Firth entered this world and absorbed it like a sponge. Her natural psychic gifts, which had been wild and uncontrolled, suddenly had a framework, a language, a technology. She was learning for the first time that there were maps of consciousness far more detailed and far more ancient than anything Freud or Jung had ever imagined. But the Golden Dawn, by the time she arrived, was already fracturing. Internal politics, ego battles, and doctrinal disputes had torn the original order apart. And Violet, always a woman who followed her own instincts, soon found herself drawn to a teacher who operated outside the standard Golden Dawn hierarchy. His name was Theodore Moriarty. Yes, that name. And the parallels with Conan Doyle's fictional villain are entirely coincidental, though the man was every bit as formidable in his own way. Moriarty was an esoteric healer, a Freemason, and a man who claimed to possess abilities that would sound flatly impossible to most people. He practiced psychic healing, he performed exorcisms, he dealt with cases of etheric attachment, situations where he claimed discarnate entities had fastened themselves onto living people and were draining their vitality. Violet became his student. She watched him work. She assisted in his cases, and she began to develop her own understanding of how invisible forces operated. An understanding that blended her psychological training with the ceremonial magic of the Golden Dawn and the practical hands-on occultism that Moriarty taught. She would later immortalize him as the character Dr. Taverner in her collection of occult short stories. The Secrets of Dr. Taverner, a book that reads like a cross between Sherlock Holmes and the X-Files, with each story based on a real case from Moriarty's practice. It was also during this period that Violet Firth adopted the name by which the world would come to know her. She took her magical motto, the Latin phrase from her family crest, Dion Fortune, meaning by God and fate. She shortened it, and Dion Fortune was born. Every magician needs a power base. Every tradition needs a sacred center. For Dion Fortune, that center was Glastonbury. Picture the landscape, the flat, once-drowned marshlands of Somerset stretching out in every direction, and rising from them like the prow of a vast sunken ship, the extraordinary cone of Glastonbury Tor, terraced by ancient hands into a spiral pathway that winds to the summit, where the ruined tower of St. Michael's Church stands like a lone sentinel against the sky. This is land soaked in myth. By Christian tradition, Joseph of Arimathea came here after the crucifixion, planted his hawthorn staff in the earth, and founded the first church in Britain. By Arthurian legend, this is Avalon, the Isle of the Dead, the gateway to the other world, where the wounded king was carried after his final battle. And by the older, deeper traditions that Dion Fortune tapped into, Glastonbury was an outpost of Atlantean civilization, a place where the mystery schools of the lost continent had established a colony of learning that survived the great cataclysm and seeded the spiritual traditions of the West. Fortune was drawn to Glastonbury with an intensity that she described as almost physical. The first time she stood at the foot of the Tor, she felt, she said, the veil between the worlds grow thin. The air filled with silver sparkles. Presences moved around her. She raised her arms in invocation and something answered. She established a permanent base there. She acquired buildings near the Chalice Well, that ancient spring of iron red water that has been sacred since before recorded history, and she founded what would become the most important magical organization in 20th century Britain, the Fraternity of the Inner Light, later renamed the Society of the Inner Light. The fraternity operated on 2 levels. In London at 3 Queensborough Terrace, Dion maintained a lecture center, library, and ceremonial temple where members could study, train, and participate in ritual. In Glastonbury, she maintained the retreat center, where deeper work was done. Work that involved direct contact with the inner plane adepts, visionary journeys into the other world, and experiments in consciousness that pushed the boundaries of what was considered possible. The training system she developed was methodical and demanding. Outer members received monthly magazines and studied materials. Those who chose to advance were put through a rigorous course of instruction that corresponded to the spheres of the Kabbalistic tree of life, beginning at Malkuth, the physical plane, and ascending through progressively deeper levels of initiation. At each stage, the student was required to demonstrate mastery of specific practices: meditation, visualization, pathworking, ritual technique, and the ability to maintain psychic equilibrium under stress. Fortune was a demanding teacher. She expected discipline, she expected commitment, and she had zero tolerance for the kind of ego inflation and self-delusion that plagued so many esoteric organizations. She had seen what happened when untrained people dabbled in forces they could neither understand nor control. She had cleaned up the wreckage and was determined that her other students would be properly prepared. One of her most vivid descriptions of early magical experimentation comes from the time before the fraternity was formally established. She describes leaving her body during an astral projection exercise while a group of students maintained the circle around her physical form. While she was out, phenomena erupted: bells, voices, physical disturbances. Her companions panicked and broke the circle. Dion, still in trance, began performing involuntary acrobatics, arching on her head and heels, convulsing across the room. One member of the group was thrown across the room by an unseen force and was bedridden for 3 weeks afterwards. It was incidents like these that taught her the absolute necessity of proper training, proper protection, and proper respect for the forces being invoked. The inner worlds, she learned, are every bit as real as the outer one, and considerably more dangerous to be unprepared. While the cosmic doctrine mapped the grand architecture of existence, Dion Fortune was simultaneously engaged in a far more practical and far more dangerous field of study. She never forgot what happened to her at Studleigh. She never forgot the devastating force that psychic assault, and her training deepened and her sensitivity increased. She began to encounter case after case of individuals who were suffering from similar attacks, people whose lives were being systematically destroyed by forces they could neither see nor understand. In 1930, she published a book that would become her most widely read work, Psychic Self-Defense. This is where I was first exposed to Dion Fortune. This book is remarkable. It is remarkable because it treats psychic attack as a real phenomenon with identifiable symptoms, specific causes, and practical countermeasures. Make sure to check out my episode on psychic self-protection, which I go in deep about some of her techniques. It catalogs a taxonomy of psychic threats, from the unconscious draining of vitality by what she called psychic vampires, to deliberate attacks by trained occultists, to haunting by discarnate entities, to the creation and projection of artificial thought forms that could take on a life of their own. She described how a psychic attack manifests. She explained there was sudden, inexplicable exhaustion, the vivid nightmares that feel more real than waking life, the sense of malevolent presence, cold, heavy, oppressive, that settles over a room like a fog, the strange coincidences that begin to cluster around the victim, the erosion of willpower, the creeping paralysis of the spirit. And she provided detailed step-by-step methods for defense. The creation of psychic barriers, visualized shields of light and force that could be erected around the aura. The practice of grounding, reconnecting, and invocations that could break hostile connections and restore integrity of the psychic field. She was blunt about the reality of these phenomena. She had experienced them firsthand. She had treated dozens of cases in her role as an occult practitioner, and she had no patience for skeptics who dismissed the entire field without investigation. At the same time, she was equally blunt about the dangers of paranoia. She cautioned her readers that the vast majority of psychological disturbances have perfectly mundane explanations. She insisted that anyone experiencing distress should first consult a qualified physician or psychologist. Only after rational explanation had been exhausted, she said, should the possibility of psychic attack be considered. This balance, this combination of open-minded investigation and rigorous critical thinking is what sets Dion Fortune apart from so many other writers in the occult field. She was training in psychology. She understood the mechanisms of projection, transference, and delusional thinking, and yet she maintained, based on her direct experience, that there existed a category of phenomenon that psychology alone could never explain. Psychic Self-Defense remains in print nearly a century after its publication. It has sold hundreds of thousands of copies, and it is still considered by practitioners around the world the definitive manual on the subject. What makes the book endure is its practicality. Fortune refused to deal in vague mystical hand-waving. She gave readers specific tools. She taught the lesser banishing ritual of the pentagram, a golden dawn technique for clearing psychic space. She described the construction of a sphere of protection, a visualized egg of white light that I teach that surrounds and seals the aura against intrusion. And it works. She explained how to use symbols, the cross, the hexagram, the pentagram, as focal points for concentrating defensive intention. She taught the art of closing down the psychic centers after meditation or ritual work so that the practitioner would walk back into ordinary life fully grounded, fully sealed, and fully sovereign in their own consciousness. She described in unflinching detail some of the most bizarre cases she had ever personally encountered. A woman plagued by a vampire-like entity that appeared at night and drained her vitality until she was barely able to function. A man whose former magical teacher had created a thought form, an artificial construct of concentrated mental energy, and directed it against him as a weapon of revenge. A haunted house where the residual psychic charge from centuries of suffering had created a self-sustaining vortex of negative energy that affected everyone who entered. In each case, Fortune traced the mechanism, she identified the source, she applied the countermeasure, and she documented the result. Her approach was methodical, clinical, and devastatingly effective. She treated the invisible world with the same seriousness that a doctor treats the physical body. Because to her, the invisible world was every bit as real and its disorders every bit as dangerous. If Psychic Self-Defense was her most popular book, the mystical Qabalah, published in 1935, was her masterpiece, her magnum opus, the work for which she is most revered among serious students of the Western mystery tradition. The Qabalah, spelled with a Q, to distinguish the Western esoteric tradition from the Jewish Qabalah, from which it derives, is a vast system of mystical philosophy based on a diagram called the Tree of Life. The tree consists of 10 spheres, called the Sephiroth, connected by 22 paths. Each sphere represents a fundamental principle of existence, from Kether, the crown, the first point of manifestation at the top of the tree, down through Chakma, wisdom, Binah, understanding, Chesed, mercy, Geburah, strength, Tifereth, beauty, Netzach, victory, Hod, splendor, Yesod, foundation, and finally to Malkuth, the kingdom, the physical world, at the base. The 22 paths connecting the spheres correspond to the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet and the 22 major arcana of the Tarot. The entire system forms a comprehensive map of consciousness, from the highest, most abstract levels of divine emanations down to the dense physical plane of everyday experience. Dion Fortune did something extraordinary with this ancient system. She made it accessible. She took material that had been guarded for centuries behind layers of secrecy, coded language, and deliberate obscurity, and she wrote about it in clear, vivid, penetrating English prose. She brought the Tree of Life alive. She showed how each sphere related to lived human experience, to emotions, to relationships, to creativity, to power, to spiritual aspiration. She demonstrated how the paths between the spheres could be walked in meditation, each one opening into a specific landscape of the inner world. And she insisted in a way that was revolutionary for her time that the Qabalah was a living system, a practical toolkit for the transformation of consciousness. She wrote that the Tree of Life was a system of psychology and a means of spiritual development that is the equal of yoga systems of the East and is more suited to the Western-type mind. This was important because at the time, many Western seekers were turning to Eastern traditions, Hinduism, Buddhism, Vedanta, for the spiritual depth they felt was lacking in Christianity and mainstream Western culture. Fortune acknowledged the validity of these Eastern paths, but she believed strongly that the Western psyche required a Western system, one rooted in the mythological, symbolic, and cultural inheritance of Europe, Greece, Egypt, and the ancient Near East. The mystical Qabalah provided that system, and it did so with a combination of intellectual rigor and mystical passion that was rarely matched. The book remains to this day the single most recommended introduction to the Western Kabbalistic tradition. If you want to understand the foundation upon which Western ceremonial magic is built, this is where you start. Dion Fortune was a formidable non-fiction writer, but she believed the deepest truths of magic could only be fully conveyed through fiction. She believed that the rational mind, for all its power, had limitations, and that certain states of consciousness, certain flavors of reality could only be transmitted through the medium of story, image, and mythic narrative. Her novel Sea Priestess, published in 1938, is widely regarded as the finest novel ever written on the subject of real ceremonial magic. It blew me away. It tells the story of a lonely, repressed shopkeeper named Wilfred Maxwell, who encounters a mysterious woman, Vivian LeFay Morgan, who initiates him into the ancient rites of Isis, the great mother goddess. Through this fictional work, Fortune was able to express ideas that she could never have published openly in her nonfiction. Ideas about the nature of sexual polarity as magical force, about the transformative power of the feminine principle, about the way in which the worship of the goddess could heal the deep wounds of a culture that had repressed the feminine for centuries. The Sea Priestess and its sequel, Moon Magic, which Fortune was still dictating from her deathbed, which was published posthumously, became enormously influential within the emerging pagan and Wiccan movements of the mid-20th century. Doreen Valiente, one of the founding mothers of modern Wicca, cited Dion Fortune's novels as a primary inspiration. The concept of the High Priestess as the central figure in magical ritual was the living embodiment of the goddess, can be traced directly through Fortune's fiction to her own magical practice. But Fortune's novels carried an even deeper teaching, one that she could only hint at in her nonfiction. This was her doctrine of magical polarity. Fortune taught that the deepest magical power arises from the dynamic interplay between masculine and feminine forces, a principle she reflected at every level of the cosmos, from the poles of a magnet to the dance of yin and yang in Chinese philosophy, to the relationship between pillars of Kabbalistic Tree of Life. She insisted that these forces were complementary, that each required the other to complete the circuit, and that when properly balanced and directed, the polarity between them could generate enormous transformative power. In practice, this meant that Fortune's most advanced magical workings involved a priest and a priestess working together in ritual, each embodying one pole of the cosmic current, each calling upon the other to awaken the deepest dimensions of consciousness. The priestess, in particular, served as the living vessel of the goddess, the channel through which vast ancient feminine forces could flow into manifestation. This was revolutionary in a world of male-dominated magical orders where women were often relegated to subordinate roles or excluded entirely from advanced work. Dion Fortune placed the priestess at the absolute center of the magical operation. She taught that the feminine principle was the gateway, the portal through which all manifestation occurs. Every woman, she wrote, is a priestess of the goddess. Every woman carries within her the power to open the doors between worlds. This teaching would echo forward through the decades, shaping the ritual structure of modern Wicca, influencing feminist spirituality, and redefining how an entire generation of practitioners understood the role of the feminine in magical and spiritual work. You cannot tell the story of Dion Fortune without addressing the complex relationship with other towering figures of 20th century British magic, including Aleister Crowley. On the surface, they could hardly have been more different. Crowley was flamboyant, scandalous, crazy, some would say weird, provocative. Read his book, The Hagiography of Aleister Crowley. A man who revealed in his reputation as the wickedest man in the world. Fortune was measured, disciplined, respectable, a woman who insisted what she called sane occultism and maintained meticulous ethical standards in her work. Crowley worked with the dark, transgressive currents of Thelema and the left-hand path. Fortune worked with the Christian and Hermetic framework of the Western mystery traditions. And yet, this is the part that most people miss. They were working with the same fundamental forces. They both drew from the Golden Dawn tradition. They both understood the Qabalah as the master key to Western magic. They both recognized the centrality of sexual polarity in magical work. And they both believed with absolute conviction that trained human consciousness could reach into the hidden dimensions of reality and bring back genuine power. Fortune initially kept her distance from Crowley. She even lampooned him, thinly disguised in one of her early stories. But as she matured, and her own work brought her deeper into the same territories that Crowley had explored, she recognized a kinship that transcended their surface differences. In 1945, the two finally met in person. Kenneth Grant, who was Crowley's secretary and one of the foremost occultists of the 20th century, was present at the meeting. He later wrote that even in her final illness, Fortune transmitted a tremendous psychic vitality that struck him forcibly. He described her as the magical Shakti of the new eon, a woman who was fully conscious of her role as a living vessel of the goddess force. Grant recalled that Fortune discussed with Crowley the possibility of reviving the ancient pagan attitudes toward cosmic and elemental forces. In one remarkable conversation, Fortune asked Crowley for specific details about a ritual she wanted to describe in her final novel. Details that involved techniques from tantric traditions that both practitioners understood. She told Crowley that she too had been in contact with an entity every bit as awesome as Aiwass, the intelligence that had dictated the Book of the Law to Crowley decades earlier. After Fortune's death, Crowley wrote a letter to a close associate claiming that he and Fortune had shared a secret understanding. He expressed a desire to take over her organization. Think about that. Aleister Crowley, the man who called himself the Great Beast 666, the most infamous magician of the modern age, respected this woman enough to want to carry on her work. The great Austin Osman Spare, another legendary occultist, read one of Fortune's novels and returned it with a characteristically brief comment. She's one of us. Behind the masks, behind the different approaches, and the different temperaments, the adepts recognized each other. This brings us to where we began. The war. The letters, the extraordinary campaign of psychic resistance that Dion Fortune organized against the Third Reich. When Britain entered World War II in September of 1939, Dion Fortune was 48 years old. She was already in declining health. She had spent decades pushing her body and mind to limits that few people ever approach. And yet, when the darkness came, she did something that no military strategist would have predicted. She rallied her occultists. Every Wednesday she composed a letter, instructions received, she said, from the inner plane masters, and sent it to a network of trained practitioners across the country. Every Sunday at the appointed hour, this network would sit in meditation, facing London, and perform a coordinated visualization. They visualized angelic presences standing guard over the coastlines of Britain. They held the image of great pillars of light surrounding the island. They projected the symbol of the Rose Cross, the central emblem of the Western mystery tradition, as a shield against the forces of darkness that they believed were operating in the Nazi regime. Fortune believed and stated explicitly in her letters that the Nazi leadership was employing occult practices of its own. She believed that the demonic energy driving the Reich was organized and directed by individuals who understood at some level the same forces she had spent her life studying. And she believed that the only adequate response to magical attack was magical defense. Was it effective? There is, of course, no controlled experiment we can point to. But here is what we can say. The weekly meditations continued throughout the war. The network held. The participants reported vivid shared experiences, visions, synchronicities, and a sense of connection that defied rational explanation. And Britain survived. The participants described seeing in their meditations towering angelic figures standing along the English Channel. They reported shared visions of knights in armor riding through the skies. They experienced collectively a sense of vast protective power gathering over the island, a dome of light, a wall of force, an invisible shield held in place by the concentrated will of hundreds of trained minds working in concert. Fortune herself described the work in terms that anticipated modern concepts of coherence fields and collective consciousness. She taught that when multiple minds focus on the same visualization at the same time, the resulting psychic charge is far greater than the sum of its parts. That consciousness, like electricity, can be amplified through the proper circuitry of ritual intention and group coordination. We know today from research at institutions like the Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research Laboratory and the HeartMath Institute that group meditation and focused intention can produce measurable effects on random number generators and electromagnetic fields. We know the coherent groups produce different results than incoherent groups. The mechanism remains unexplained. The data remains stubbornly real. I've experienced this in my own life, at my own events, and I know that you have too if you've ever meditated or shared in a spiritual practice with a group, even at a church. Now, Dion Fortune would have found none of this surprising. She had been training people to do this for 20 years. The letters Fortune wrote during this period were collected after her death and published as the Magical Battle of Britain. They remain one of the most extraordinary documents of the Second World War, a testament to one woman's unshakable conviction that consciousness itself is a weapon, a shield, and a force that can turn the tides of history. The war ended, but Dion Fortune would never celebrate the peace. In January of 1946, she was diagnosed with leukemia. She died within days. Some sources say January 6th, others January 8th, at the Middlesex Hospital in London. She was 55 years old. Her body was taken to Glastonbury, that sacred ground that had been so central to her life and work, and buried in the local cemetery. You can visit her grave today. People still leave flowers. People still come from around the world to stand at that small plot and pay their respects to a woman who spent her entire life reaching beyond the visible world and bringing back treasures for the rest of us. Her right-hand man, Charles Loveday, died the following year and was buried beside her. After her death, her successor ordered the ceremonial destruction of her diaries, photographs, personal correspondence, and private papers, all of them burned deliberately to prevent any kind of personality cult from forming around her memory. It is one of the great losses in the history of Western esotericism. The full story of Dion Fortune, the intimate details of her inner life, her private experiences, her unpublished teachings, went up in smoke. And yet, despite the destruction of her papers, despite the passage of nearly 80 years, her influence has only grown. The Society of the Inner Light, which she founded, still exists. Her books are still in print, still studied and practiced. Organizations that trace their lineage directly to her, the Servants of the Light, the Gareth Knight Group, and many others continue to train students in the methods she developed. W. Ernest Butler, one of her longtime students, described her as a woman whose consciousness extended through many dimensions over many lives, using numerous masks. To her many admirers, she seemed to teach one of the perfect manifestation of their own spiritual inclinations, whether Christian, pagan, theosophical, Kabbalistic, Hermetic, or spiritualist. She was all things to all seekers. And that, as Alan Richardson wrote in his biography, Priestess, is the nature of the true priestess. So why does Dion Fortune matter today? Why should you care about a British occultist who died before the invention of television? Because the questions she asked are the questions we're still asking. Can consciousness affect reality? Is the mind capable of perceiving and interacting with dimensions of existence beyond the physical? Are there forces in the universe that respond to focused human intention? Is there an architecture to reality that we can learn to perceive and work with? Modern science is circling these questions from its own direction. Quantum physics has demonstrated that the act of observation affects the behavior of subatomic particles. Neuroscience has revealed that the brain is far more plastic and responsive to directed intention than anyone imagined a century ago. The placebo effect, the documented fact that belief alone can trigger measurable physiological changes, remains one of the great unexplained phenomenon of modern medicine. Dion Fortune would have smiled at all of this because she spent her entire life insisting that consciousness is the primary reality and that the physical world is a downstream effect of forces that originate in dimensions we are only beginning to understand. She defined magic as the art of causing changes in consciousness in accordance with the will. Let me say that again. The art of causing changes in consciousness in accordance with will. She never said magic was about waving wands or chanting spells. She said it was about the disciplined, directed, intentional alteration of one's own consciousness. And she maintained that when consciousness changes, reality follows. Now, that's a radical claim, and it is a claim that an increasing number of researchers, philosophers, and serious thinkers are beginning to take very seriously. Dion Fortune left us a body of work that is extraordinary in its range and depth. The Cosmic Doctrine, which maps the formation of the universe and the journey of consciousness through planes of existence. I'll be doing a deep dive on that next, so keep an eye out for that. The mystical Qabalah, which provides a practical system for navigating the inner worlds. Psychic self-defense, which teaches us how to protect our consciousness from hostile influences. The Sea Priestess and Moon Magic, which transmits the deepest truths of the goddess mystery through the power of mythic fiction. The training and work of an initiate, which lays out the path of spiritual development with clarity and precision. And the magical Battle of Britain, which shows us what happens when a trained consciousness meets the darkest forces of history head on. As I said in a future episode, I'm going to take you deep inside the Cosmic Doctrine itself, into the ring cosmos, the ring chaos, the traveling atoms, the lords of flame and form, and show you why this strange, difficult, magnificent text is one of the most complete models of reality ever committed to paper. But for today, I want to leave you with something Dion Fortune wrote near the end of her life, something that captures in a single sentence the essence of everything that she believed and everything she worked for. She wrote, "The universe is a thought in the mind of God." If that's true, which is what the law of one tells us, and she spent her entire life operating on the assumption that it is, then you and I are thoughts within that thought. Conscious sparks within a conscious cosmos. And if we can learn to align our individual awareness with the vast intelligence that dreamed us into being, then there is quite simply no limit to what becomes possible. That is Dion Fortune. That is the legacy of the Priestess. And the door she opened is still standing wide. You can find all episodes of The Reality Revolution at therealityrevolution.com. And welcome to The Reality Revolution. 3 days, 9 sessions. You're invited to a complete timeline shift. This July, The Reality Revolution comes home to Anaheim for the most immersive 3-day experience I have ever built. Activate your pineal gland, meet your higher self, quantum jump into your greatest timeline, enter the bliss body healing state, step into the flow of large sums of money, open fully to love and shift into the higher density new earth. Every session combines deep teaching with guided activation, the same techniques that have produced extraordinary transformations at every Reality Revolution event. Friday night, the community celebrates together. Saturday evening, we have a special appearance from Daryl Anka. Sunday, you walk out as a new version of yourself. July 24th through the 26th at the Hilton Anaheim. Early bird pricing available now at www.brianscottlive.com/Anaheim.